Good morning, and thank you for coming out on this sunny morning to come and sit in darkness. As I woke up at about 6 o'clock this morning, it occurred to me that I was, terrified of there being a full house, and then it occurred to me that I was even more terrified of there being an empty house. So thank you for coming and supporting the lesser of my two fears. I'd like to begin with this photograph of Francisco Artigas, the subject of my talk. And draw on a quote from his grandson Alejandro, who described him as very strict. He asked people to kindly dry the bar of soap after they'd washed their hands. This photo of him in his office at his desk shows him as this meticulous man with an antique pistol there at his desk, just poised atop it as if ready to dispatch anyone who throws a coat too carelessly upon a chair. It's probably a cigarette lighter, but it's nonetheless, it's there waiting for whatever may come along. Tidiness and order may not be essentials to good architecture, but they were certainly central to the buildings that Francisco Artigas designed in the mid-century. So here I'll be making the case that his houses, perhaps better than anyone's, really exemplified a new era in Mexican architecture at mid-century. He worked extensively around Mexico for about 40 years, and during that time he designed offices, commercial buildings, chapels, hotels, golf clubs, schools when he worked for the federal construction program, school construction program, and lots of houses. Stylistically, as you can see just from these images, he was very eclectic. He's certainly best known for his modernist work, but after 1960, increasingly, he's working in an historicist mode, which is not usually the stuff of modernism week here in Palm Springs, but nonetheless. We have his own house there outside of Mexico City in Desierto de los Leones, which is a sort of neo-Baroque come Moorish fantasy with heavy stone walls and round arches, towers and finials, a kind of Moorish garden with a bubbling fountain out front. Inside of revival-style houses that he designed, you see dark wood paneling and carved beams and brackets, heavy wood doors and classical moldings and plasterwork, wrought iron, patterned tiles, stone vaults, and crucifixes like the one over at the far left. But note the photo montage in the background. This is the work that we're going to be talking about today. By the way, Esther McCoy, the noted Southern California art critic of mid-century, wrote the introduction to the only book exclusively focused on Artigas, and in it she wrote this: "The closer his buildings are to Mexico City, the closer they are to the rationalist style," so the international style, as most of us would call it. This always makes me think of Porfirio Diaz. Porfirio Revolution broke out in 1910, and probably the most famous quote he left behind was, "Poor Mexico, so far from God and so close to the United States." This quote, from Esther McCoy always puts me in mind of Porfirio Diaz. The further his buildings are from Mexico City, the closer they are to God, perhaps. Well, in the capital, during the 1950s and 60s, this is the sort of thing he designed. His work was decidedly modernist. He's best known for these long, low-slung, minimalist modern houses, particularly those that he built in the gardens of El Pedregal, this very well-known, very famous upscale garden subdivision developed by Mexico's best-known modern architect, Luis Barragan. Francisco Artigas is an admired architect. He's very much admired by mid-century modernist enthusiasts. You can find blogs and Facebook pages devoted to his work. But he's not particularly very well known outside of Mexico. Not much has been written on him, very little in English. There's the book with the introduction by Esther McCoy I mentioned. I wrote an article on him. There's not a whole lot else in English. The best thing on him is written in Spanish over here. It's never been translated. It was published in Barcelona, and it's never been sold or made available in the United States. If you're looking for it, it's very hard to find, but I will mention that the authors are Alfonso Perez Mendez and Alejandro Abdelon. Las Casas del Pedregal. It's not exclusively about Artigas, but there's a lot of Artigas in there. So, why this neglect of this interesting and important modern architect? Well, you know, the mechanics of architectural fame are pretty complicated, and there's lots of reasons why or why not someone becomes well known within the field, becomes an iconic figure. One reason, I think, in Artigas's case, connects to the idea of innovation. So much of modern architectural history has been focused on this idea of innovation. Modern architecture is rightly understood as a response, an architectural response to new urban and social conditions. Modern architects worked with new materials, new mechanical systems, new structural systems, new types of programs and functions for buildings. The architects that are best known, that are canonical for the most part, are those that invented new forms or reimagined old themes for the modern age. These formgivers, as they've sometimes been called, the authors of a signature style, like Frank Lloyd Wright or Le Corbusier, people whose work looked like nothing that really came before it, and a lot of things that came after it. In the case of Mexico, Barragán is that figure, the best known architect out of Mexico, the best known modern architect out of Mexico, Pritzker Prize winner. If any of you have ever stayed at a Camino Real hotel, for instance, you've probably been surrounded by Barragán's aesthetic. Bright colors drawn from Mexican folk art, blocky, heavy, chunky, asymmetrically composed cubic houses with flat roofs and roughly textured walls, doors and windows just kind of punch through these heavy walls, accents of Mexican craft or references to historic architecture. Let's see, my pointer's not working here. There we go. Like the vigas in the ceiling at his own house. This, again, for many people, represents Mexican modernist architecture, this signature style that really spawned a whole generation of Barraganistas. Artigas wasn't really that kind of an innovator. His work lacks the distinct stylistic signatures, say, of Barragán's. In fact, it looks similar, superficially at least, to that of a lot of others working at mid-century. Mies van der Rohe, Richard Neutra, the followers of these well-known architects. The case study houses in California, which probably many of you are familiar with, which were being built at the same time that Artigas was in his heyday in Mexico. A lot of architects working in Mexico City, in the Pedregal, work in a similar mode, like this house, for instance, by Antonio Atolini Lac, which is built right about the same time as this house by Artigas. These long, low-slung, glass-walled pavilions, flat roofs, long, unbroken fascias, and floor-level horizontals. These houses feature lightweight wood or metal frames. Interiors are contained just by sheets of unbroken glass. The demarcations between indoors and out are almost erased. They're very open to their sites, very well lit. Long, open plans, big, spacious rooms filled with contemporary furniture by Knoll or Herman Miller. Plants and sunlight coming in and warming and softening the cool glass and metal that's all around. Gardens, patios, barbecues, space for outdoor living, for rest and recreation. You know, this is, again, what we might think of as the mid-century California dream, which also became a sort of a Mexican dream at that point, providing freedom of movement inside and out for the occupants of these houses, for this newly mobile and energetic, sophisticated modern audience. Well, Artigas was part of this Southern California that sponsored the Case Study House program, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. Um, these case study houses, though, I should mention them. The case study houses were prototypes for post-war modern living, using, again, modern materials and modern systems developed during World War II. But the case study houses, for the most part, were very modest. They were small, two-bedroom, two-bath houses for two working parents of two children. They were, again, prototypes for modern living at a fairly basic level for families with no servants. Now, when we turn to the gardens of El Pedregal, where Barragan and Artigas, our subject here today, were working, we're dealing with much larger houses. Larger houses for wealthier clients, people who demand more privacy, security, formality, luxury. Stone walls and metal gates surround these often extensive properties. Swimming pools glisten out back. Inside, we have polished marble and exotic hardwoods, formal dining rooms. Kitchens are separated from the dining area. They're quarters for live-in servants in many cases. And the clients are from the upper tiers of society. This man down here in the corner, who commissioned this house from Artigas, Mauricio Loc and Iziguare, this colorful, even though it's in black and white, you can tell it's a pretty colorful outfit he's wearing. He was a bullfighter, among other things. He was also the stepson of Mexico's president during the mid-50s, Adolfo Ruiz Cortines. He was an Air Force pilot in Mexico and the pilot of the presidential plane. So, in some ways, he's a relatively characteristic Artigas client in this period. Now, what distinguishes Artigas's houses? These simple, elegant frameworks for modern living in close relationship with nature. They're very high quality houses in terms of their materials, their composition, their construction. There's an audaciousness to the form, these impossibly long horizontals and cantilevered elements that create carports. They're really quite dazzling houses, and luxurious materials are used, as I've already mentioned. The quality of the craftsmanship is very good. So, for instance, I spoke with one of his clients who talks about a rock wall. Most people, when building a rock wall that serves as a surface to an exterior, would merely, set the rocks into some kind of plaster with mortar connecting the rocks. But Artigas actually had the rock cut into a tongue and groove kind of pattern, so it would fit perfectly and hold together very well. These were very seismically stable houses, very well constructed houses, for one thing. Their sensitive siding is another thing that distinguishes them. And their sheer numbers. He did a great number of houses, particularly in the gardens of El Pedregal. Luis Barragan, along with his collaborators, designed the road layout and a few model houses, but Barragan, for the gardens of El Pedregal, was responsible for no more than 5 or 6 structures. Artigas, on the other hand, is said to have designed more than 50. Although the number's probably a little bit lower, maybe closer to 35 or 40, but still a lot of houses in this one neighborhood. And this was a very important neighborhood, as I'll spell out here for you. Barragan set the tone at the gardens of El Pedregal, but Artigas ultimately really defined its look. And not just El Pedregal, but other elite subdivisions in places like Acapulco took this look as well. So really, more than any other Mexican architect at mid-century, I would say, his houses really embody the image of elite modern living in Mexico, particularly in the capital during the 1950s. They really provide the kind of residential design ethos of what historians and economists have called the Mexican miracle. A little bit of biography for you here. He was the son of an army general His father, who you see down below there, was also the police chief of Mexico during the teens and early 20s. The family moved from Mexico City when Francisco Artigas was young to Cotija, and he was raised there. He then went back to Mexico City, where he studied engineering briefly at the national, what later became the National University, UNAM. He only stayed in his engineering program for about a year, and then he opted out to travel and to study more informally on his own, particularly looking at modernist work around Mexico City and in Southern California. His earliest buildings are, just to go back, up here in Sinaloa State, in Culiacan. They include houses, office and commercial buildings like the one you see here. Buildings that we would, again, characterize today as international style. In their flat roofs, their absence of ornament, their absence of reference to any kind of historical style of architecture. But Artigas and his partners in this case localize the work by including things like this tozontle wall, using this kind of reddish-brown stone that you see back in the work of Aztec builders, and you also see in a lot of modernist work. You see modernist features that are very familiar from the work of Le Corbusier and the Brazilian Oscar Niemeyer, such as these pilotis, these thin reinforced concrete columns. So this is, again, the kind of work that Artigas was doing early on, but it's distinguished from just the typical run of international style work by these kind of regionalized features like the tozontle wall, by the curves up here at the roof line that suggest a kind of influence of Brazilian modernism from Niemeyer and others. This particular building always makes me think of the Museum of Modern Art in New York, which was built a few years before and features the same sort of portal roof line here that you see up here, and these bands of windows, which the building ends up looking a bit like the top two stories of the Museum of Modern Art. Well, in 1948, Artigas returned to Mexico City. By this time, actually 2 years earlier, Miguel Alemán had been elected president in Mexico. And he really established the Partido Revolucionario Institucional, the PRI, the Institutional Revolutionary Party. This party has its roots back in the 1920s, and it continued to dominate Mexican politics into the 1990s. But Artigas really gave it its best-known form, the form it carried into the present. Alemán has been described by historians such as Enrique Krauss as a businessman president, very pro-development, very market-friendly. His economic policies are seen to have really helped stabilize the country. And beginning in the 1940s, Mexico reduced its foreign debt. Its rate of inflation lowered, its wages rose across the board, consumer demand grew, industrial production surged, building surged in Mexico City and elsewhere. So we really see a building boom happening in Mexico, an economic boom that lasts into the 1970s. And this is referred to by historians and economists as the Mexican miracle, or the Milagro Mexicano. This Mexican miracle included dramatic spending on infrastructure, roads and dams, for instance. Government investment, for instance, in the film industry. The government got behind film studios. This is the age, really, of the golden age of Mexican cinema, which begins a little bit earlier, but really peaks in the 1940s and 50s with big stars like Maria Felix and Jorge Negrete and Pedro Infante and others. There was an audience in Mexico for this sort of thing, for these films, a demand, a new wealth, a new amount of leisure time, an expanding middle class. These films really came to dominate Spanish-speaking audiences in these years. These years of the Mexican miracle were also a period of dramatic urban growth and a building boom in a place like Mexico City that you see represented in photographs like this, with these, dramatic new skyscrapers rising up higher and higher along the skyline. Primary, secondary education became universal in Mexico at this time. A new campus was built for the National University, the oldest university in the Americas. The National University of Mexico goes back to the 16th century, but its faculties were scattered all over the city prior to this time. In the 1940s, a cohesive US-style campus was constructed down in a portion of the city south of the center. So if you look at this map, and you know Mexico City, the cathedral, the Zocalo, the center is up here. We're talking about this area down here in the south, about 10 to 12 miles south of the center. This is an area known as El Pedregal, the rocky place or the stony place. It's a volcanic lava field that originated about 1,000 years ago. And it was a site that was never really much developed. It remained rocky. It did not have much building there. There were a few small factories. It was known as a place where bandits hid out, where hermits lived, where dangerous spirits might lurk. It was a very romantic place, though, and it was a place that also included pre-Columbian ruins. There's a pyramid out there called Cuicuilco that goes back to before the time of the eruption that formed this place. This was available land, seismically stable, very picturesque, full of distinct native plants, vegetation, flowers, trees, and things. It was very much prized. neighborhood of what came to be called the Allemand bourgeoisie. Allemand, I didn't mention it earlier, but Allemand in his 1946 campaign for the presidency promised every Mexican a Cadillac, what was it, a Cadillac, a cigar, and a ticket to the Bulls. And this was where they would have them, this Cadillac in the carport, this Allemand bourgeoisie. The Gardens of El Pedregal, and here you see Luis Barragan with President Allemand touring the Pedregal right next to the university city. This was the northern entrance, the main boulevard, and these large lots, 2.5 acres of space typically per house in the early days of the development. This was a place made possible by the automobile, by private automobile traffic. And this in a country where, at this time, private automobile ownership was not particularly widespread, still something of a luxury. So this place really was meant to appeal to a very privileged audience who wanted some distance from the city, but still proximity to its amenities, distance from its crime, its pollution, its traffic, its crowding, but access to its museums and restaurants and such. Diego Rivera comes into this story. He was one of the devotees of this place. Says nothing would be gained if the structures built here destroyed the natural beauty of the place. So developers must assure the conservation of the site's geographic character, Rivera writes. Streets should follow the natural contours of the land, building lots need to be large enough to have to bring all the light, views of the site into the interior. This crisp, modern form, great arch over a natural declivity that's bridged further and sort of grotto-like pool created underneath. The cantilevered roof creating a carport. This is a characteristic feature of Artigas' houses. Automobiles are always well provided for in these Pedregal houses. They become part of the house. The machine garden, the machine enters into the house. Modern houses, modern, typically North American sedans, combined together in these designs. I will mention that this bridge house, whose plan you see up here, here's the main portion of the house. There's the carport right there. There's an extension back here with a kind of a bedroom wing. This house appears to have been inspired by another Latin American house built just a few years earlier in Argentina by Amancio Williams, the famous bridge house in Mar del Plata. This was already pretty widely published by the 1940s, so it seems likely that Artigas was looking in this direction and, again, taking his own kind of spin on this very interesting motif, a way to build on rocky, uneven ground like the Pedregal offer. The next project that Artigas and Greenham did was this. And here we really move toward the characteristic sort of Artigas look in the Pedregal, the glass box floating on top of a rock, poised atop the rocks. What is this? It's not a house. It's a sales pavilion. The Gardens of El Pedregal, after all, was a real estate subdivision. Aragon designed this place to sell real estate, and people would bring in their own architects. But to the best of his abilities, he really wanted to determine the kind of architecture that would be built there. So model houses, a sales pavilion. Again, this was meant to show people coming here to buy property for development what kind of architecture they could build, what people might imagine for their own family's future in this place. This was located near the southern entrance of the property. Again, kind of architectural ideal, sleek, modern, minimal, dominated by glass, lightweight concrete frame, elevated above the landscape so as to preserve and highlight the native rock vegetation. And then this very dramatic, wonderful feature, two-stage ramp that leads you up. Modernists love ramps, by the way. Stairs are for squares, right? You know, stairs are the old way of moving between two floors, right? Here's another view right here. And this, I should mention, is the second sales pavilion at the Gardens of El Pedregal. It replaced the previously built pavilion by Aragon, another one of those dovecotes you see in the tower up here. This is a very instructive comparison, I think. Both of these projects do the same thing in a way. They each adhere to Diego Rivera's advice to preserve the native landscape, to build an unostentatious architecture that doesn't distract one's attention from the beauty of the rocks and the vegetation. A simple, essentially cubic, minimalist modernism. But in Barragan's case, it's a much heavier, more earthbound kind of architecture. Heavy walls, a few openings, a sheltered interior. This pavilion looks a great deal like other houses that Barragan built in the Pedregal and elsewhere in Mexico City at this time. Compare this again to the lightweight pavilion floated above the rocks that Artigas put forward, a glass box of light and air. So we have these two poles here between these two architects, the solid versus the transparent, the heavy versus the light, the rooted versus the raised. Yet both of them are preserving the site and emphasizing its native beauty. We see the same contrast in their houses. Barragan and Chetto's demonstration house, riding the rocks, kind of sunk into the rocks, I guess I should say. Whereas Artigas's house, the Gomez house, which I'll talk about more in a moment here, rides it like a ship, rides that landscape, floats above it. Just it's a little hard to see, but notice the chimney here, this Tezontle chimney, that rough volcanic stone. It carries right underneath the house, which serves to really emphasize the way the house floats above that landscape. Now, as the 1950s rolled on and the Pedregal became a popular development and real estate sold, lots were subdivided because these vast lots, this became very valuable real estate and people subdivided their lots in many cases. The Pedregal filled with houses. By about 1960, it was really filling up. What it filled with, for the most part, looked a whole lot more like this than this. As I say, Barragan started the development, but Artigas really set the tone. Many other architects followed his lead. It wasn't really until the 1980s that architects in Mexico began to follow Barragan's lead, and by this point, the Pedregal was already, for the most part, filled. Well, this house that we see in the lower left, extraordinary house, the Gomez house. By this time, Artigas's partnership with Santiago Grina had ended. So this is his own design. It's one of the most famous houses in the Pedregal. It was the culmination of popular bus tours that were carried out in the 1950s. And it was built for a doctor, prominent doctor, the president of the National Academy of Medicine, the founder of the Children's Hospital of Mexico, set on a very large lot, 10,000 square meters, 2.5 acres, filled with dramatic blooms of lava and very lush vegetation, lush plantings that were brought in. Here you see the house. She looks fun. You enter through a gatehouse, and you wind around here, and then you park off to the side here. And then you enter up these stairs carved into the rocks. You come through a foyer and enter up into this glass box floated above the landscape. Apparently, I've never been in this house, but apparently you could see all the way to the skyscrapers of downtown, 10, 12 miles to the north. The walls of glass, it's a kind of blue-green glass divided by these thin white mullions. Again, a very elegant composition. Here you come into the house, and we're looking at the main floor here, but this is the entrance below. And notice the rough lava stone and this kind of curving line here leading to the stairs. I want to call your attention to this mural, which we'll look at a little bit more closely in a second. But again, notice the openness of the interior, this essentially unbroken open planning, and the grotto-like, rather amorphous shaped pool. That mural, though, was painted by a man named Francisco Epens, who was a very well-known artist in Mexico. He did almost 20 years worth of postage stamps for the country. He designed the modern version still in use of the official coat of arms. He did this mural at the Faculty of Medicine at UNAM, the National University. This mural, as you entered into this house floated above the rocks, shows native people of the site long before the Spanish arrived here. And there in the background is a volcano just beginning to erupt. The volcano that will form this landscape, create this rock that the Pedregal was built out for the period. But it all takes place at the Gomez house. And it's a story that is in many ways kind of characteristic of this period of the Mexican miracle, this cinematic dream of class mobility. House rising above the rocks, lit up at night. The auto mechanic, he works hard, and he gets lucky. The Cadillac becomes his. And there it is, in fact. Where is it? Right there. The Cadillac becomes his, along with the beautiful blonde and her spectacular house. By the way, I should mention that Pinal also lived in the Pedregal, still does, in a house that looks rather like an Artigas house, though designed by an architect named Manuel Rosen. She's in her 90s, and she still lives nearby the Gomez house. Unfortunately, the Gomez house is not there anymore. It was demolished in 2004. These houses were very expensive to maintain, these very large lots, came with high property taxes because it was valuable real estate. By now, the site accommodates 7 houses on what was once the site of one house, and most of the rock is gone. So the Pedregal went the way of all things. Just another house from the Pedregal here, the Wasong house. Artigas sometimes turned from these open glazed facades to these closed facades, such as you see here at the Wasong, built for an American-born, North American engineer and his family. Long, low pavilion, raised up on pilotis, stuccoed wall, broken only by this one window, and then the continuous clear story above. Again, the Cadillac in the carport, along with a little English roadster there. You enter into the glass box and rise up above the rocks into the house. About that window, I had a nice communication a few years ago with a woman named Karen Wasung Cox, who grew up in this house. Her parents built it, and she wrote to me, Mr. Artigas was very opposed to that window because he believed that it spoiled the sweep of the facade. However, my mother was adamant that it be installed. You see, it was right above the kitchen sink, and my mother believed that nobody should have to wash dishes facing a wall. It was a most useful addition, as we could see people and traffic approaching from the street without having to walk outside the house or go down the stairs to the carport. She further talks about the quality of the construction and how sound it was, how it survived Mexico's earthquakes in the years since without a scratch. Some interiors. Barragon's partners, the Bustamante brothers, both had houses designed by Francisco Artigas, both of them unfortunately demolished by now, but they survive in photographs. These, again, lush interiors, these expanses of marble on the floor and on the walls, the lush plantings, the low-slung modern furniture in the open space, the emphasis on the dining table in both of these cases. This, really becomes the center of the house. So again, with the spectacular new university city rising next door, these light-filled, open-plan suburban villas, well-stocked with modern furniture and tropical plants, with small English roadsters and big American sedans parked out front, swimming pools shimmering out back, all of this gracefully set within the lava of the Pedregal. This really was the setting for glamour and optimism circa 1955 or so. The elite architectural realization of President Alemán's otherwise rather unattainable promise of, a Cadillac for every Mexican. This was the ideal place to live in the post-war economic boom, in the years of the Mexican miracle. A place to conduct the good life now purportedly available to all, or at least to the expanding middle classes. One last house before we finish. And this one's in California. Well, it was. This was in Apple Valley, near Victorville. Artigas had hoped to open an office in Los Angeles, but that didn't come to pass. But he did build this house for an oil man and real estate developer, Newton Bass. Bass had built subdivisions nearby. He built the Apple Valley Inn, which was a popular place with movie stars and others. He eventually sold the Apple Valley Inn to Roy Rogers and Dale Evans. But this is a house in California that's in many ways quite similar to Artigas' Pedregal houses. Again, long, low-slung, riding above the rocky landscape, poised atop a mountain in this case, hundreds of feet above the valley below. The landscaping, I should point out here, was developed by Tommy Thompson, who became a good friend of Artigas's. Tommy Thompson, as some of you probably know, did the town plan for nearby Palm Desert. And Artigas also designed a house for him, which I'm not sure if it's still standing, but it was called Dos Gallos, the two roosters. Large house, almost 5,000 square feet, about half of it the 70 by 30-foot living room with an almond-shaped swimming pool that ran from indoors to out, so you could swim back and forth as you wished. Mahogany ceilings that, at the push of a button, opened up to reveal the sky overhead. 360-degree views, built-in television sets. It would have made a great lair for a Bond villain. Artigas designed most of the furniture as well as the house, but not this bed, by the way. That's purportedly a prop from Gone with the Wind, although I haven't verified that. By the way, some of you, I don't know about this audience, but some of you may keep a pistol under the pillow just for comfort. If you do, keep in mind that you're really not safe unless you have a whole gun rack filled right by the bed there. Rocks poking up through the floor, kind of mooring the dining table, linking the house to the site even as the house rises up above it. Bass liked to host grand parties here. Bob Hope, Frank Sinatra, and others were among the attendees to these parties at this house. The house itself even starred in an episode of, any Perry Mason fans here? There he is. There's Della and Perry up at the side of the house. In the case of the roving river, the house is featured, and there you see it on the top of the mountain. I can't leave this presentation without mentioning that it also appeared in this movie called Saturday Night Bath in Apple Valley, starring Charlie Weaver. Remember him from Hollywood Squares? He anchored one of the squares. I haven't seen it, but it looks really great. The house also burned down. It was restored, but then neglected, and in 2022, the city council finally voted to demolish it. Well, that's much too grim of an ending, isn't it? A lot of Artigas's work is gone. That's just, again, the way of all things. We've seen a lot of mid-century modernism disappearing in recent years. And here you can all give yourselves a pat on the back. That's, the importance of organizations like Docomomo or events like this, raising consciousness and awareness and appreciation that might even lead to action, preservation. Artigas's legacy does live on, though, certainly in the photographs, such as the ones I've been showing you here today, photographs of buildings now lost, but also in the work that does remain, and some excellent examples of his work does remain, and in the firm that still carries his name, a firm that by now has built some 2,500 projects in Europe and the Americas in 87 different cities, according to their website. Today, this kind of architecture is a source of, well, nostalgic fascination for a lot of people. It also is an architecture that really evokes the glamour and the promise, though, of an earlier and seemingly simpler era, one whose belief in the future, however naive, remains, I think, in many ways admirable and energizing. the good life coming within reach of the Mini, the Cadillac in the carport, promised to us all. And with that, I will thank you for your participation here in this event and wish you a wonderful Modernism Week. Thanks.